Look at a map of Europe today. What do you see? Neatly defined countries, clear borders, distinct flags. It all feels so permanent, right? But here's a wild truth. That modern map, it's actually a super recent invention. Welcome to this explainer on the birth of the nation-state. Today, we're diving into the chaotic, complex, and honestly, fascinating transformation of an entire continent. We're going to uncover how Europe went from this messy patchwork of royal empires into the strictly defined nation-states we know today. It's a story packed with violent revolutions, romantic poets, military conquests, and the birth of a brand new political identity.
Just take a second to look at the sheer optimism captured in this famous 1848 print by the French artist Frédéric Soriot. Look at what's going on here. Men and women of all ages and social classes, grouped as distinct nations with their own flags, all marching peacefully past the Statue of Liberty. It's this beautiful utopian vision. In his dream, absolutist institutions, represented by all those shattered crowns and scepters lying on the ground, they're dead and gone. And in their place is a world of democratic and social republics living in perfect harmony. But, well, as we'll see, turning that romantic dream into reality was anything but peaceful.
Which brings us to the central mystery of our explainer. How did we actually get from that old world to the new one? How did a continent ruled by kings who literally swapped territories like trading cards transform into a map strictly defined by nations? It's a journey that takes us all the way from high-minded philosophical ideals in Paris straight into the muddy, bloody battlefields of the Balkans.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we really need to nail down what exactly replaced those old empires. What is a nation-state? Well, it's not just about drawing lines on a map and setting up a government. It's really about the people inside those borders. In a nation-state, the majority of the citizens, not just the elite rulers, actually share a common identity, a shared history, or descent. And that was a radical departure from the massive multinational empires of the time. Take the Habsburg Empire, for example. It was just this gigantic, disjointed patchwork of Alpine regions, Bohemia, Lombardy, and dozens of different ethnic groups who basically had zero in common except for the monarch who happened to rule them.
Now, the very first clear, explosive expression of this new nationalism didn't happen quietly. It sparked in France in 1789. The French Revolution violently shattered the old order. It took sovereignty directly away from an absolute divine right monarch and shoved it right into the hands of the everyday citizens. The revolutionaries declared that, from that day forward, the people would constitute the nation and shape its destiny. They basically invented the modern political nation overnight.
But here's the fascinating part. You can't just wave a wand and declare a nation into existence, right? You actually have to manufacture its identity from scratch. And the French revolutionaries were absolute masters at this. They actively built a collective identity using some very specific tools. They pushed ideas like la patrie, the fatherland, and le citoyen, the citizen, to emphasize a united community with equal rights. They ditched the royal standard for the new tricolor flag, they abolished internal customs duties, centralized the laws, and, maybe most crucially, they actively discouraged regional dialects, aggressively pushing Parisian French as the one single common language of the entire nation. They weren't just building a country, they were building a people.
And that French identity soon went continental, largely thanks to one guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon is tricky. He essentially exported this French identity, but it came with a massive price tag. On the one hand, he brought administrative equality to the territories he conquered through his 1804 Civil Code. He wiped out feudal privileges, secured property rights, stuff the locals actually cheered for at first. But the honeymoon didn't last long. That administrative efficiency was paired with brutal military oppression, strict censorship, crushing taxes, and forced conscription to feed his endless wars. So as you can imagine, the initial enthusiasm across Europe pretty quickly morphed into fierce hostility.
But honestly, despite the massive backlash against Napoleon, the genie was out of the bottle. The real engine driving this whole new era was liberalism. Coming from the Latin root liber, meaning free, liberalism became the ultimate rallying cry for the educated middle class. Politically, it meant ditching autocracy for a government by consent, usually with a constitution and a parliament. But economically, it was arguably even more vital. It was all about free markets and getting rid of state restrictions. Just imagine being a merchant in 1833, trying to travel from Hamburg to Nuremberg, and having to pass through 11 different customs barriers, paying a 5% duty at every single one. Liberals wanted to sweep all of that away and create one unified economic territory.
Which brings us to this incredibly profound way of looking at what a nation truly is. The French philosopher Ernst Renan nailed this back in 1882. He said, a nation is a large-scale solidarity. Its existence is a daily plebiscite, basically a daily vote. What he's saying is that a nation isn't just defined by language or race or where a river flows on a map. No, it's about a heroic past, shared glories, and most importantly, the active, ongoing consent of the people to be together. It's a daily, unspoken choice to say, yes, we are still a nation. Okay, but how do you actually get millions of people to feel that large-scale solidarity? This is where culture becomes a weapon. Nationalism wasn't just built by politicians and generals. It was heavily fueled by a massive cultural movement called Romanticism. German philosophers like Johann Gottfried Herder argued that true national culture wasn't sitting in some snooty royal court. It was found among das Volk, the common people. Nationalists started using folk songs, poetry, and local vernacular language to hype up the spirit of the nation. In Poland, which had literally been wiped off the map by Russia at the time, composer Karol Karpinski kept the national spirit alive by turning simple folk dances, like the Polonaise and the mazurka, into these powerful symbols of resistance. Language and culture literally became tools of survival. So let's think about this practically for a second. How do you draw a country? If you're trying to inspire the masses, especially back then when a lot of folks couldn't read heavy political theory, how do you take this abstract, fuzzy concepts like France or Germany and make it feel real, make it something you can actually relate to?
Their solution was totally brilliant. Allegories. Artists just started representing their nations as female figures. It wasn't any specific real-world woman, but a personification of everything the country stood for. In France, you had Marianne. She wore the red cap of liberty and the tricolor, representing a true nation of the people. In Germany, they came up with Germania. You'll usually see her wearing a crown of oak leaves, because in German tradition, the oak represents heroism. These allegories took a completely abstract idea and gave it a concrete, emotional face that everyday people could instantly connect with.
All right, let's quickly track how all this chaos played out over time. Back in 1815, after Napoleon finally lost, the conservative powers, like the Austrian Chancellor Metternich, held the Vienna Congress to restore the old monarchies. They really tried to just hit rewind and turn back the clock. But you can't stop economic and social momentum. By 1834, Prussia had set up the Zollverein, this massive customs union that locked together German economic interests. And finally, the whole Prussia cooker just exploded in 1848 with the revolutions of the liberals. All across Europe, middle classes and starving workers joined forces, demanding constitutions and national unification.
But those 1848 revolutions, they largely failed to achieve their democratic dreams. And this is where our story takes a much more pragmatic, honestly kind of cynical turn. Take the unification of Germany. It wasn't achieved by a bunch of liberal democratic votes in some parliament. Not even close. It was forged by iron and blood. The Prussian monarchy, backed by their military and massive wealthy landowners, basically hijacked the nationalist sentiment. They fought 3 major wars over 7 years just to prove the absolute dominance of Prussian state power. And they ultimately forced a unified German empire into existence, strictly from the top down.
And we see a strikingly similar story play out in Italy. Italy had this long, messy history of political fragmentation, split into 7 states and heavily dominated by the Habsburgs. Now, it started with democratic idealists, guys like Giuseppe Mazzini, who founded this underground society called Young Italy. But his grassroots revolutionary uprisings totally failed. In the end, the job of actually unifying Italy fell to the elite rulers of Sardinia-Piedmont. They pulled off unification through strategic wars and elite military campaigns. And the craziest part, the vast majority of the Italian population remained completely unaware of the liberal nationalist ideology that had supposedly just united them.
Now let's contrast all that fiery continental drama with what historians call the British exception. While the rest of Europe was busy throwing up barricades in the streets and launching rapid military unifications, Britain's path to becoming a nation-state was entirely different. There was no sudden explosive revolution. Instead, it was a long drawn-out, deeply systematic parliamentary process.
The British nation was essentially manufactured through sheer English dominance. I mean, prior to the 18th century, there wasn't really a British nation. You had the English, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish. But as the English Parliament grew massive in wealth and power, it systematically imposed its will. First, they took dominance over Scotland with the Act of Union in 1707. Then came the forcible incorporation of Ireland in 1801, right after brutally suppressing Catholic revolts. The English actively promoted this new British identity, pushing the Union Jack flag, the English language, the national anthem, while simultaneously systematically suppressing the distinct ancient cultures of the nations they were absorbing.
Okay, so we've seen nations unified by shared culture, by raw military force, and by parliamentary dominance. But what happens when that beautiful, romantic idea of a nation hits a geographic brick wall? What happens when multiple, newly hyped-up national identities claim the exact same piece of dirt?
That brings us to the absolute powder keg of 19th century nationalism, the Balkans. This region was a ticking time bomb. You had the ruling Ottoman Empire rapidly falling apart. At the exact same time, those volatile ideas of romantic nationalism were spreading like wildfire among the fiercely jealous Balkan states. Everyone wanted to expand their borders, mostly at the expense of their neighbors. And to make things infinitely worse, all this intense local friction was being heavily manipulated by massive big power rivalry. Russia, Germany, England, Austro-Hungary, they all wanted a piece of the pie and total control over the region.
Which leads us to our final, lingering question. Think back to that very first image we looked at, Frederick Sorio's beautiful 1848 dream of peaceful, independent republics marching hand in hand. The cold reality of achieving that dream involved cultural suppression, military oppression, and incredibly intense geopolitical rivalry. Ultimately, those overlapping, aggressive nationalist claims in the Balkans acted as the direct spark that plunged the entire world into the horrific devastation of the First World War. It really forces us to step back and ask, is the nation-state truly the ultimate guarantor of a people's liberty, like Ernst Renan believed? Or did the romantic dream of nationalism ultimately cost the world its peace? Something to seriously think about the next time you look at a map. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.